fine.
You don't know how to have a
Fine.
conversation.
Yeah, that's fine.
So
You
I'd
can
like to continue with
vouch.
AD
Shut up
for
while I'm
Timothy,
talking, right?
for
I asked you a
Arias.
fucking yes or
I
no
haven't finished
question.
talking.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Don't talk and drive. We need you. We need videos of you.
But I did want to see if you could steer the conversation. Do you know the argument that you gave in the Khalil video?
Yeah, I can send it. Syllogism.
No. Could you talk about it a bit more, because people are a bit confused on it?
I mean, I don't really.
Did you flush it out with Jack or something?
I've parsed out lips.
Yeah, you laid it out pretty thoroughly in the first few minutes when I was talking to you. On the replay, you could listen to it.
Wait,
which one?
Jack, lay out the argument, please. If you were to be so a noble man.
Can you do it really simply for my audience?
What, the skepticism thing?
Yeah.
I think so. The one that Darth gave in the Khalil video.
Something like, if God exists without a world, Cartesian scenarios are possible. If Cartesian scenarios are possible, omniscience is impossible. God is taken to be omniscient, so God therefore can't exist. Something like that.
What modality are you? No, I'm just kidding. Imagine
if God exists only in connection with a world, putting aside that he created it for the sake of argument, then Cartesian scenarios are not possible if there's a world? Is that the idea?
No.
Well, Cartesian scenarios might be possible if there are worlds, but I
Can you
I don't think
explain
they're
the Cartesian
possible.
scenario?
Can I explain what that
explain?
is?
Yeah.
It's just a view. It's just a Cartesian scenario is a scenario in which one is massively deceived in one's beliefs, or massively mistaken about what one believes.
So then why the emphasis in the argument about God existing and a mind existing and no world and all that, and eternalism, therefore Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, blah, blah.
Well, the idea is that if there can be a mind without a world, then because if you had a view that mental states were constituted by things in the world, then Cartesian scenarios wouldn't be possible. There couldn't be a mind without a world, right? So if you think what's in your mind is constituted by things in the world, then a world is required to have a mind. But the idea of God existing prior to creation,
the content of what's in your mind, you mean?
Yeah, the content. Yeah, your mental content. God. The idea is that if God can exist without a world, that means he can have mental content without a world. But if he can have mental content without a world, that seems to open things up to Cartesian scenarios, right? Because if what constitutes what's in your mind is not something in the world, then what you believe could be radically at odds with what the world is like. Right? Like, in other words...
All right, sir.
In other words, if internalism about content is true, then whether a world exists or not doesn't have to change what you believe. You could still have all the same beliefs, and there might be no world out there at all. Right? And that's what it means for Cartesian scenarios to be possible.
Hey, Darth. I, I watched that video, and there was a lot of confusion going on. Not on your part, but on everyone else's. Or at least, oh, what was his name? You got Khalil. Is that who are you debating? Talking to?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I had a question. So I'm surprised, and maybe I misunderstood the argument a little bit. If there's a Cartesian scenario, I'm jump right into it. If there's a Cartesian scenario, it would presuppose something that would be non that would God would not be the uncontingent or first cause or whatever you want to call it. So there would be something other than God that would exist before God or outside of God, right? So that would be kind of my response to your thing, right? Isn't that? I'm
No,
surprised no one brought that up. No, how does that not work?
no. The idea has nothing to do with the causes, right? The whole idea is that if um if God's mind can exist without an external world, then mind internalism is true, right? If mind internalism is true, mind internalism is just a thesis that um, the majority of, not the majority, but the entirety of an agent's thoughts are reliably self known, right? And there's no external world to furnish mental content. There's just the mind, and that's it. Um, if mind internalism is true, then that presupposes a Cartesian epistemology. A Cartesian epistemology is an epistemology where Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, where um, most of an agent's beliefs can be false, right? Even if, let's say, and this is where the semantical thesis comes in. Even semantical content of, let's say, like the words that are uttered by a brain and a vat, those words, brains and vat, they don't actually refer to anything. The concept of brains, the concept of vats don't pick out anything in the world because there's no world to begin with, right? So the meaning of those terms also aren't external from the mind as well. So once they accept that internalism, mind internalism presupposes a Cartesian epistemology, it's going to follow from that Cartesian scenarios are not logically impossible, um, because the Cartesians be applied to um, this example of a god, and this god is defined as a mind that sans creation exists alone, right? It was only God and that's it. Okay? If Cartesian scenarios can apply to bringing about skepticism, right? Or skepticism about other minds, then if one were to be consistent with that epistemology, there's no problem in positing it even sans creation, even sans, let's say, human minds, right? Um, so as long as they affirm that there's no logical contradiction in affirming those scenarios, then it follows from that, then omniscience is impossible. And the reason why that premise follows is because we take omniscience to mean that an entity necessarily knows all true propositions, right? Um, so if a being if a being isn't omniscient, it entails that there's at least one logically possible world where it doesn't know all true propositions, right? Um, and in virtue of there being one logically possible world where, in this case, God doesn't know all true propositions, um, it's just to say that the Cartesian scenarios would actually apply to him, right? Um, in which case, if once you show omniscience is impossible, God cannot, at least that type of a God cannot exist, where it knows all true propositions. Now, the response to this argument is just to say, like a very weak response is that it's analytically true that an omniscient being um, necessarily knows all true propositions. So if it's a true proposition that it isn't a brain in a vat, it would know that it's not a brain in a vat.
No, that wasn't.
That's presupposing two
Yeah,
things. Number one,
yeah.
it begs the question against the argument. But number two, more interestingly, it presupposes that the skeptical scenarios are false, not just incoherent. It presupposes that,
Right.
yeah, in virtue of the fact that brain in a vat scenarios are false, um, yeah, God doesn't need to know that he isn't a brain in a vat because God cannot know false propositions. He can only know true propositions. And the true proposition is that he isn't a brain in a vat. But again, that is both begging the question against the argument and assuming that internalism is false.
Yeah,
So that's what I asked for an argument
yeah. So
to show
okay,
why
so
that.
yeah, that I don't think that I
Okay.
agree with you. I agree with you on everything you're saying. Let me just clarify two things. I think I agree with almost everything. And I don't. I also agree that that's not a good counter because yeah, you're begging the question or not addressing the actual argument. You're just sidestepping it. Okay, so there's I agree that in your proposition, God would not know if he is a brain in the vat. That's true. There's two situations that I want to talk about. There's one in which he's a brain in a vat, so there's a vat for him to be in which case he is a contingent being in that universe, right? So there'd be something that would be providing. There's a demon that would be providing him the illusion, right? Okay, he couldn't know in this scenario, but in that place he wouldn't necessarily be the God that a lot of Christians or theists or whatever would understand as God because he'd be contingent, right? And then the other scenario would be he is just alone, and he is the contents of his mind, and he wouldn't necessarily even know what he's doing because I mean, he could be delusional or something. But where would the content be coming from in a situation where there is just God and he's all now say everything's internal and he's in that case he'd be creating his own content which he would know all the propositions of unless he's just crazy, right?
Well, there's a lot that was said there. I don't think the argument rests upon um, the Cartesian scenarios being true, right? That's what's misunderstood here. It's not saying if Cartesian scenarios are true, omniscience is impossible. Now, that is true, actually. That if it were the case that Cartesian scenarios were true and they apply to God, then God cannot be omniscient. Yeah, that is true, but that's not even what the argument is saying. It's not saying that Cartesian scenarios are true or actually the case. It's just saying as long as they're possible, right? And it's affirmed by um, God's mind that there's no external world to furnish his content. God ultimately does not have um, like any final appeal, given his background of beliefs, to say that for certain he knows that there is an external world, right? Because whatever can be posed, whatever theory of justification a theist wants to bring to explain God's foreknowledge away, um, they can still face skeptical objections up to some point, right? You could ask, well, um, maybe if you're a phenomenal conservative, you might say something like, well, God can appeal to seemings, right? It just seems to be the case for God that he knows all true propositions, but obviously that we could throw that in the waste bin, right? He could be heavily deluded on whether or not those seemings are actually a real representation of the, let's say, of what's going on even in his mind, right? So the skepticism doesn't even have to apply to the external world. You can apply to the skepticism to his own beliefs, right? God can be vastly deluded that most of his beliefs are reliable, right? And as long as the theist accepts that there's no contradiction, right? They don't need to necessarily affirm that the scenarios are true. As long as they affirm that they're possible, that already undercuts omniscience there, because all what it means for God to be omniscient is that, at least in the Orthodox understanding of omniscience, is that he knows all true propositions, including future tense propositions, and he knows those true propositions in all logically possible worlds, right?
Okay. So you're so just to boil it down, what you're saying is he can, because he has to, and you mean to know as an absolute certainty about all propositions, and because he can't be absolutely certain on that one thing, that he's not a brain in a vat, that he has some uncertainty about that that negates omniscience, right?
Not only it's
That's
not
part of your
only
argument.
absolute certainty, it's the fact that unless if you want to say something um like um like God's internal mental content doesn't like preclude the possibility for there being like some scenario to undercut the reliability of his beliefs. Maybe there is an argument that like God's self-knowledge, um maybe it's like maybe they could come up with some ad hoc justification and say something like, well, God has X knowledge. And what I mean by X knowledge is that he knows that all the Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible. And um, since it's a true proposition that Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible, then God would have this type of knowledge where he would know that Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible. But you see, the theist can make that claim, right? But the interesting thing is whether or not this is the only way I think they could defeat this argument. If they want to say something like I just said, right, that Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible, and that's a true proposition, and since anything that is a true proposition, God knows, well, then if Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible is a true proposition, then God knows that, right? Yeah, they could run that argument, but you see, then that will get into a whole other discussion about whether or not Cartesianism is coherent, um, whether or not there's like reasons like regarding our epistemologies to reject the skepticism about the external world. So that's going to get into a whole different argument. But the thing is, even if they're successful at showing why Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible simpliciter, it's interesting because then they'll have to stop this nonsense about, well, um, you can't know anything, right, unless God exists or something, or
Well,
you
yeah,
can't. Yeah, that goes out of the water because
well, they would just claim, I'm just thinking on their behalf, which is dangerous. They would claim God guarantees reliability of your senses, including God's own senses, right? So the Cartesian
no,
scenarios in that case would be,
yeah,
logically
but
incoherent.
that's just an ad hoc way of arguing, right?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what they do. But no, I do like that idea that if, and I know I'm paraphrasing here, but if Cartesian scenarios are possible, there's knowledge which is beyond the grasp of God. There would be something he could not or she could not know, right?
Mm,
I mean, that's
and I wouldn't phrase it like that.
um,
I would just say that
yeah.
I would just say that it undercuts the necessity of him knowing all true propositions.
Yeah, I
right?
know. I'm trying to think of it.
He can still
Yeah,
know all true propositions, but not in all possible worlds,
right. Yeah,
right?
that's what I mean. There is in the
But
set of
then he's
all
not
possible things.
omniscient, right? Because
Yeah,
omniscience just doesn't mean that you know all true propositions, um, because then that's if you're just defining it like that, well, sure, um, technically, the theist might say there isn't like a direct defeater in that case, if they just define omniscience that way. But if we're interpreting omniscience as him knowing all true propositions in all logically possible worlds, then obviously that's a much stronger claim, in which this argument is specifically attacking with Cartesian scenarios, right?
yeah.
Uh,
Sorry,
but
when I said yeah,
a theist can drop that definition and obviously adopt another one. Um, uh, an open theist would say, well, this argument doesn't go through because there's certain propositions that um, God doesn't have epistemic access of, like he doesn't have epistemic access of future tense propositions. So in which case the future is open, right? In some sense. Um, so maybe they wanna maybe they redefine omniscience that way. Yeah. This argument wouldn't apply. But this argument applies to how omniscience is traditionally defined, um, like 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 in terms of their theology.
no, I agree. When I said knowledge, I meant knowledge is in the knowledge of all true propositions in all possible worlds. I meant it in the broadest sense of saying there's something he or the God wouldn't know in all those worlds if the Cartesian is true. So it's interesting. It's a good argument. It's interesting. I saw was it Jeff trying to run it on Dart the other day? It was kind of entertaining.
No, I didn't know Jeff tried to run it on
He
Darth.
did. He did. He was being so polite to try and to try and get Darth to play along, but it didn't work.
Wait, Jack, can you get Friction up here? I don't know why he doesn't. Is he busy? Or does he not like talking to Blue Leafs?
I don't know why he might have stepped away.
Okay. Do you like the new profile picture?
Yeah, I love that.
Um so Jack can because the way I formulate the argument is different from how Jack runs the argument, a little bit different. Like I add several things into there. Jack, how would you run the argument? Would you include like like would you mention internalism about semantic content into the argument, or do you think that's not needed?
I don't think you really need to say anything about that.
Okay. Would you just run it like um if God's mind well, God's mind is weird because God is a mind. If God sans creation exists sans an external world, then Cartesian scenarios are logically possible. Would that be the first premise?
Sounds like it might be.
Okay, then premise two: if Cartesian scenarios are logically possible, um, then omniscience is impossible. Are you wanting to say omniscience is logically impossible for the second premise?
I mean, if it's the case that Cartesian scenarios are possible, then omniscience is going to be impossible.
Okay, and so then the conclusion of that argument is um, if God exists, if God exists, um, sans an external world, then omniscience is logically impossible. It's like a hypothetical syllogism. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. Conclusion, therefore, if P, then R. Would you run it like that?
Well, probably.
Do you see what I did there? If P, then R.
So I do have a question. You can help me out. So Darth always likes to say he's arguing, and I've heard people do this with the whole mind thing, or they like to play both sides of the fence, for lack of a better term. God's a mind, but it's a mind we don't understand. And every time you try and apply human,
Cool.
and this is what Justin did. Every time you try and apply human, attributes to that mind, we can't do that, right? So I just think their whole equivocation between a human mind, and God is just unwarranted, or whatever you want to call it. How do you argue that? I'm just wondering, how do you argue against somebody equating human mind with some other mind when they know no properties of that thing?
I mean, it's rich to say, to claim that there's some form of equivocation here, done by the atheists, by confusing human knowledge and providing a definition for that, and then having that same term, but then applying a different definition for God's knowledge. That's not what we're doing. In fact, that's exactly what the theist is doing in these occasions, because the theist um, say that both of us have knowledge, but they define they define knowledge in two different senses, right, or in two different meanings. On one hand, they want to say humans are the type of agents that um, know things in virtue of the fact that they have justified true beliefs. Okay. Then when you ask them, okay, does God have knowledge? They'll say yes. And they'll say, well, does God justify his beliefs? They'll say no. Well, then in virtue of what does he have knowledge then, right? Either it's going to be the case that they equivocate, or they give like a very lousy account for knowledge, right? Something unintelligible, or not an account at all, or just say, well, why give an account, right? He just has knowledge, but his knowledge is brute, in some sense. It can't be explained. It's kind of weird to say that God's knowledge is brute, um, given the fact that we usually interpret God as this perfectly rational agent, um, who um, would obviously not only know all true propositions, but in virtue of it knowing all true propositions, would know what explains um, the true propositions that pertain to his actions, right? Or how he not arrive at his beliefs, but um, how he knows how he knows that his beliefs themselves are reliable, right? Um, God knows all of that, but if there's no account given as to what constitutes his knowledge, then why make any of these audacious claims about his nature? I just don't understand, right? If
Yeah,
you say that this being is incredibly, almost up to the point that you can't conceive anything greater than this being, and this being knows all true propositions, on one hand you want to make that claim, but on the other hand you want to say, well, I don't want to give an account, or it's inconceivable to give an account, or in Khalil's own words, I'll just appeal to mystery. Well,
Right.
if you
Well,
feel the mystery, why make the
yeah.
claim in the first place?
No, that's exact. That's the crux. That's the crux of my question, right? So, if you just generally throw out an analogy, that's, let's say, not something not religious, like my computer is like a rat in a maze. You're like, and I said, I'm speaking analogically, as Darth likes to say, about a computer, saying it's like a rat in a maze, and the rat in the maze finds its way to a cheese. Well, that's a really bad analogy. They don't really share any properties, or very few properties, and so they're so far apart that the analogy really would not be appropriate. And I think that